Appendix A. The process of validating special consensus. Validating special consensus involved at every point the accumulation of Don Juan's teachings. For the purpose of explaining the cumulative process, I have arranged the validation of special consensus according to the sequence in which the states of non-ordinary reality and special ordinary reality occurred. Don Juan did not seem to have fixed the process of directing the intrinsic order of non-ordinary reality and special ordinary reality in an exact manner. He seemed to have isolated the units for direction in a rather fluid way. Don Juan began to prepare the background for special consensus by producing the first special state of ordinary reality through the process of manipulating cues about the environment. He isolated by that method certain component elements from the range of ordinary reality, and by isolating them, he directed me to perceive a progression toward the specific. In this instance, the perception of colors that seemed to emanate from two small areas on the ground. Upon being isolated, those areas of coloration became deprived of ordinary consensus. It seemed that only I was capable of seeing them, and thus they created a special state of ordinary reality. Isolating those two areas on the ground by depriving them of ordinary consensus served to establish the first link between ordinary and non-ordinary reality. Don Juan directed me to perceive a portion of ordinary reality in an unaccustomed manner. That is, he changed certain ordinary elements into items that needed special consensus. The aftermath of this first special state of ordinary reality was my recapitulation of the experience. From it, Don Juan selected the perception of different areas of coloration as the units for positive emphasis. He isolated for negative emphasis the account of my fear and fatigue, and the possibility of my lacking persistence. During the subsequent preparatory period, he placed the bulk of speculation on the units he had isolated, and he carried over the idea that it was possible to detect in the surroundings more than the usual. From the units drawn from my recapitulation, Don Juan also introduced some of the component concepts of man of knowledge. As the second step in preparing special consensus on the corroboration of the rule, Don Juan induced a state of non-ordinary reality with La Fofora Williamsi. The total content of that first state of non-ordinary reality was rather vague and disassociated, yet the component elements were very well defined. I perceived its characteristics of stability, singularity, and lack of ordinary consensus almost as clearly as in latter states. These characteristics were not so obvious, perhaps because of my lack of proficiency. It was the first time I had experienced non-ordinary reality. It was impossible to ascertain the effect of Don Juan's previous directing on the actual course of the experience. However, his mastery in directing the outcome of subsequent states of non-ordinary reality was very clear from that point on. From my recapitulation of the experience, he selected the units to direct the progression toward specific single forms and specific total results. He took the account of my actions with a dog and connected it with the idea that Mescalito was a visible entity. It was capable of adopting any form. Above all, it was an entity outside oneself. The account of my actions also served Don Juan in setting the progression toward a more extensive range of appraisal. In this instance, the progression was toward a dependent range. Don Juan placed positive emphasis on the notion that I had moved and acted in ordinary reality almost as I would have in everyday life. The progression toward a more pragmatic use of non-ordinary reality was set by giving negative emphasis to the account of my incapacity to pay logical attention to the perceived component elements. Don Juan hinted that it would have been possible for me to examine the elements with detachment and accuracy. This idea brought forth two general characteristics of non-ordinary reality: that it was pragmatic and that it had component elements that could be assessed sensorially. The lack of ordinary consensus for the component elements was brought forth dramatically by an interplay of positive and negative emphasis placed on the views of onlookers who observed my behavior during the course of that first state of non-ordinary reality. The preparatory period following the first state of non-ordinary reality lasted more than a year. Don Juan employed that time to introduce more component concepts of man of knowledge, and to disclose some parts of the rule of the two allies. He elicited also a shallow state of non-ordinary reality in order to test my affinity with the ally contained in Datura Inoxia. Don Juan used whatever vague sensations I had in the course of that shallow state to delineate the general characteristics of the ally by contrasting it with what he had isolated as Mescalito's perceivable characteristics. The third step in preparing the special consensus on the corroboration of the rule was to elicit another state of non-ordinary reality with Lophophora Williamsi. Don Juan's previous directing seems to have guided me to perceiving this second state of non-ordinary reality in the following manner. The progression toward the specific created the possibility of visualizing an entity whose form had changed remarkably from the familiar shape of a dog in the first state to the completely unfamiliar form of an anthropomorphic composite that existed seemingly outside myself. The progression toward a more extensive range of appraisal was evident in my perception of a journey. In the course of that journey, the range of appraisal was both dependent and independent, although a majority of the component elements depended on the environment of the preceding state of ordinary reality. The progression toward a more pragmatic use of non-ordinary reality was perhaps the most outstanding feature of my second state. It became evident to me in a complex and detailed manner that one could move around in non-ordinary reality. I also examined the component elements with detachment and accuracy. I perceived their stability, singularity, and lack of consensus very clearly. From my recapitulation of the experience, Don Juan emphasized the following. For the progression toward the specific, he gave positive emphasis to my account that I had seen Mescalito as an anthropomorphic composite. The bulk of speculation on this area was centered on the idea that Mescalito was capable of being a teacher and also a protector. In order to direct the progression toward a more extensive range of appraisal, Don Juan placed positive emphasis on the account of my journey, which obviously had taken place in the dependent range. He also put positive emphasis on my version of the visionary scenes I viewed on the hand of Mescalito, scenes that seemed to be independent of the component elements of the preceding ordinary reality. The account of my journey and the scenes viewed on Mescalito's hand also enabled Don Juan to direct the progression toward a more pragmatic use of non-ordinary reality. He first put forth the idea that it was possible to obtain direction. Second, he interpreted the scenes as lessons concerning the right way to live. Some areas of my recapitulation which deal with the perception of superfluous composites were not emphasized at all, because they were not useful for setting the direction of the intrinsic order. The next state of non-ordinary reality, the third one, was induced for the corroboration of the rule with the ally contained in Datura Inoxia. The preparatory period was important and noticeable for the first time. Don Juan presented the manipulatory techniques and disclosed that the specific purpose I had to corroborate was divination. His previous directing of the three aspects of the intrinsic order seemed to have produced the following results. The progression toward the specific was manifested in my capacity to perceive an ally as a quality. That is, I verified the assertion that an ally was not visible at all. The progression toward the specific also produced the peculiar perception of a series of images very similar to those I had viewed on Mescalito's hand. Don Juan interpreted these scenes as divination, or the corroboration of the specific purpose of the rule. Perceiving that these series of scenes entailed also a progression toward a more extensive range of appraisal. This time the range was independent of the environment of the preceding ordinary reality. The scenes did not appear to be superimposed on the component elements, as had the images I viewed on Mescalito's hand. In fact, there were no other component elements besides those that were part of the scenes. In other words, the total range of appraisal was independent. The perception of a completely independent range also exhibited progression toward a more pragmatic use of non-ordinary reality. Divining implied that one could give a utilitarian value to whatever had been seen. For the purpose of directing the progression toward the specific, Don Juan put positive emphasis on the idea that it was impossible to move by one's own means in the independent range of appraisal. He explained movement there as being indirect and as being accomplished in this particular instance by the lizards as instruments. In order to set the direction of the second aspect of the intrinsic level, the progression toward a more extensive range of appraisal, he centered the bulk of speculation on the idea that the scenes I had perceived, which were the answers to divination, could have been examined and extended for as long as I wanted. For guiding the progression toward a more pragmatic use of non-ordinary reality, Don Juan placed positive emphasis on the idea that the topic to be divined had to be simple and direct in order to obtain a result that could be usable. The fourth state of non-ordinary reality was elicited also for the corroboration of the rule of the ally contained in Datura Inoxia. The specific purpose of the rule to be corroborated had to do with bodily flight as another aspect of movement. A result of directing the progression toward the specific may have been the perception of soaring bodily through the air. That sensation was acute, although it lacked the depth of all the earlier perceptions of acts that I had presumably performed in non-ordinary reality. Bodily flight appeared to have taken place in a dependent range of appraisal, and it appeared to have entailed moving by one's own power, which may have been the result of a progression toward a wider range of appraisal. Two other aspects of the sensation of soaring through the air may have been the product of directing the progression toward a more pragmatic use of non-ordinary reality. They were first, the perception of distance, a perception that created the feeling of an actual flight, and second, the possibility of acquiring direction in the course of that alleged movement. During the subsequent preparatory period, Don Juan speculated on the supposedly deleterious nature of the ally contained in Datura Inoxia, and he isolated the following areas of my account. For directing the progression toward the specific, he placed positive emphasis on my recollection of having soared through the air. Although I did not perceive the component elements of that state of non-ordinary reality with the clarity that was customary by then, my sensation of movement was very definite, and Don Juan used it to reinforce the specific result of movement. The progression toward a more pragmatic use of non-ordinary reality was established by centering the bulk of speculation on the idea that sorcerers could fly over enormous distances, a speculation that gave rise to the possibility that one could move in the dependent range of appraisal and then switch such movement over into ordinary reality. The fifth state of non-ordinary reality was produced by the alloy contained in Psilocybe mexicana. It was the first time that the plant was used, and the state that ensued was more in line with a test than with an attempt to corroborate the rule. In the preparatory period, Don Juan presented only a manipulatory technique. As he did not disclose the specific purpose to be verified, I did not believe the state was elicited to corroborate the rule. Yet the direction of the intrinsic level of non-ordinary reality set earlier appeared to have terminated in the following results. Directing the progression toward specific total results produced in me the perception that the two allies were different from each other, and that each was different from Mescalito. I perceived the ally contained in Psilocybe mexicana as a quality, formless and invisible, and producing a sensation of bodilessness. The progression toward a more extensive range of appraisal resulted in the sensation that the total environment of the preceding ordinary reality, which remained within my awareness, was usable in non-ordinary reality. That is, the expansion of the dependent range seemed to have covered everything. The progression toward a more pragmatic use of non-ordinary reality produced the peculiar perception that I could go through the component elements within the dependent range of appraisal, in spite of the fact that they appeared to be ordinary elements of everyday life. Don Juan did not demand the usual recapitulation of the experience. It was as if the absence of a specific purpose had made this state of non-ordinary reality only a prolonged transitional stage. During the subsequent preparatory period, however, he speculated on certain observations he had made on my behavior during the course of the experience. He placed negative emphasis on the logical impasse that prevented my believing that one could go through things or beings. With that speculation, he directed the progression toward a specific total result of movement through the component elements of non-ordinary reality perceived within the dependent range of appraisal. Don Juan used those same observations to direct the second aspect of the intrinsic level, a more extensive range of appraisal. If movement through things and beings was possible, then the dependent range had to expand accordingly. It had to cover the total environment of the preceding ordinary reality, which was within one's awareness at any given time, since movement entailed a constant change of surroundings. In the same speculation, it was also implicit that non-ordinary reality could have been used in a more pragmatic manner. Moving through objects and beings implied a definite point of advantage which was inaccessible to a sorcerer in ordinary reality. Don Juan next used a series of 3 states of non-ordinary reality elicited by Lophophora williamsi to prepare further the special consensus on the corroboration of the rule. These 3 states have here been treated as a single unit because they took place during 4 consecutive days, and during the few hours in between them I had no communication whatsoever with Don Juan. The intrinsic order of the 3 states has also been considered a single unit with the following characteristics: the progression of Mescalito as a visible anthropomorphic entity capable of teaching. The ability to give lessons implied that Mescalito was capable of acting toward people. The progression toward a more extensive range of appraisal reached a point where I perceived both ranges at the same time, and I was incapable of establishing the difference between them except in terms of movement. In the dependent range, it was possible for me to move by my own means and volition, but in the independent range, I was able to move only with the aid of Mescalito as an instrument. For example, Mescalito's lessons comprised a series of scenes that I could only watch. The progression toward a more pragmatic use of non-ordinary reality was implicit in the idea that Mescalito could actually deliver lessons on the right way to live. During the preparatory period that followed the last state of non-ordinary reality in this series, Don Juan selected the following units. For the progression toward the specific, he placed positive emphasis on the ideas that Mescalito was instrumental in moving one through the independent range of appraisal, and that Mescalito was a didactic entity capable of delivering lessons by allowing one to enter into a visionary world. He also speculated on the implication that Mescalito had voiced its name and had supposedly taught me some songs. Those two instances were constructed as examples of Mescalito's capacity to be a protector. And the fact that I had perceived Mescalito as a light was emphasized as the possibility that it might at last have adopted an abstract, permanent form for me. Stressing these same units also served Don Juan in directing the progression toward a more extensive range of appraisal. During the course of the three states of non-ordinary reality, I clearly perceived that the dependent range and the independent range were two separate aspects of non-ordinary reality, which were equally important. The independent range was the area where Mescalito delivered its lessons, and since these states of non-ordinary reality were supposed to have been elicited only to seek such lessons, the independent range was, logically, an area of special importance. Mescalito was a protector and a teacher, which meant that it was visible, yet its form had nothing to do with the preceding state of ordinary reality. On the other hand, one was supposed to journey, to move in non-ordinary reality in order to seek Mescalito's lessons, an idea that implied the importance of the dependent range. The progression toward a more pragmatic use of non-ordinary reality was set by devoting the bulk of speculation to Mescalito's lessons. Don Juan constructed these lessons as being indispensable to a man's life. It was a clear inference that non-ordinary reality could have been used in a more pragmatic manner to draw points of reference which had value in ordinary reality. It was the first time Don Juan had verbalized such an implication. The subsequent state of non-ordinary reality, the ninth in the teaching, was induced in order to corroborate the rule of the ally contained in Datura Enoxia. The specific purpose to be corroborated in that state was concerned with divination, and the previous direction of the intrinsic level ended in the following points. The progression toward a specific total result created the perception of a coherent set of scenes which were purported to be the voice of the lizard narrating the events to be divined, and the sensation of a voice that actually described such scenes. The progression toward an independent range of appraisal resulted in the perception of an extensive and clear independent range that was free from the extraneous influence of ordinary reality. The progression toward a more pragmatic use of non-ordinary reality ended in the utilitarian possibilities of exploiting the independent range. That particular trend was set up by Don Juan's speculation on the possibility of drawing points of reference from the independent range and using them in ordinary reality. Thus, the divinatory scenes had an obvious pragmatic value, for they were thought to represent a view of acts performed by others, acts to which one would have had no access by ordinary means. In the following preparatory period, Don Juan emphasized more of the component themes of man of knowledge. He seemed to be getting ready to shift to the pursuit of only one of the two allies, the ally Umito. Yet he gave positive emphasis to the idea that I had a close affinity with the ally contained in Datura Anoxia, because it had allowed me to witness an incidence of flexibility of the rule when I had made an error in performing a manipulatory technique. My assumption that Don Juan was ready to abandon teaching the rule of the ally contained in Datura Anoxia was fostered by the fact that he did not isolate any areas of my recapitulation of the experience to account for directing the intrinsic level of the subsequent states of non-ordinary reality. Next was a series of 3 states of non-ordinary reality elicited to corroborate the rule of the ally contained in Psilocybe mexicana. They have been treated here as a single unit, and although a considerable time elapsed in between them, during those intervals Don Juan made no attempt to speculate on any aspect of their intrinsic order. The first state of the series was vague. It ended rapidly, and its component elements were not precise. It had the appearance of being more like a state of non-ordinary reality proper. The second state had more depth. I perceived the transitional stage into non-ordinary reality separately for the first time. During the course of that first transitional stage, Don Juan revealed that the specific purpose of the rule, which I had to corroborate, dealt with another aspect of movement, an aspect requiring his exhaustive supervision. I have rendered it as moving by adopting an alternate form. As a consequence, 2 aspects of the extrinsic level of non-ordinary reality became evident for the first time: the transitional stages and the teacher's supervision. Don Juan used his supervision during the first transitional stage to pinpoint the subsequent direction of the 3 aspects of the intrinsic level. His efforts were channeled, in the first place, to produce a specific total result by guiding me to experience the precise sensation of having adopted the shape of a crow. The possibility of adopting an alternate form in order to achieve movement in non-ordinary reality entailed in turn an expansion of the dependent range of appraisal, the only area where such movement could take place. The pragmatic use of non-ordinary reality was determined by directing me to focus my attention on certain component elements of the dependent range in order to use them as points of reference for moving. During the preparatory period that followed the second state of the series, Don Juan refused to speculate on any part of my experience. He treated the second state as if it had been merely another prolonged transitional stage. The third state of the series, however, was paramount in the teachings. It was a state in which the process of directing the intrinsic level culminated in the following results. The progression toward the specific created the easy perception that I had adopted an alternative form so completely that it even induced precise adjustments in the way I focused my eyes and in my way of seeing. A result of those adjustments was my perception of a new facet of the dependent range of appraisal, the minutiae that formed the component elements, and that perception definitely enlarged the range of appraisal. The progression toward a more pragmatic use of non-ordinary reality culminated in my awareness that it was possible to move in the dependent range as pragmatically as one walks in ordinary reality. In the preparatory period following the last state of non-ordinary reality, Don Juan introduced a different type of recapitulation. He selected the areas for recollection before he had heard my account. That is, he demanded to hear only the accounts that pertained to the pragmatic use of non-ordinary reality and to movement. From such accounts, he set the progression toward the specific by giving positive emphasis to the version of how I had exploited the crow's form. Yet he attached importance only to the idea of moving after having adopted that form. Moving was the area of my recapitulation on which he placed an interplay of positive and negative emphasis. He gave the account positive emphasis when it enhanced the idea of the pragmatic nature of non-ordinary reality, or when it dealt with the perception of component elements which had permitted me to obtain a general sense of orientation, while seemingly moving in the dependent range of appraisal. He placed negative emphasis on my incapacity to recollect with precision the nature or the direction of such movement. In directing the progression toward a wider range of appraisal, Don Juan centered his speculation on my account of the peculiar way in which I had perceived the minutiae that formed the component elements that were within the dependent range. His speculation led me to the assumption that, if it were possible to see the world as a crow does, the dependent range of appraisal had to expand in depth and had to extend to cover the whole spectrum of ordinary reality. To direct the progression toward a more pragmatic use of non-ordinary reality, Don Juan explained my peculiar way of perceiving the component elements as being a crow's way of seeing the world. And logically, that way of seeing presupposed entrance into a range of phenomena beyond normal possibilities in ordinary reality. The last experience recorded in my field notes was a special state of ordinary reality. Don Juan produced it by isolating component elements of ordinary reality through the process of cueing about his own behavior. The general processes used in directing the intrinsic level of non-ordinary reality produced the following results during the course of the second special state of ordinary reality. The progression toward the specific resulted in the easy isolation of many elements of ordinary reality. In the first special state of ordinary reality, the very few component elements that were isolated through the process of cueing about the environment were also transformed into unfamiliar forms deprived of ordinary consensus. However, in the second special state of ordinary reality, its component elements were numerous, and although they did not lose their quality of being familiar elements, they may have lost their capacity for ordinary consensus. Such component elements covered, perhaps, the total environment that was within my awareness. Don Juan may have produced this second special state in order to strengthen the link between ordinary and non-ordinary reality by developing the possibility that most, if not all, of the component elements of ordinary reality could lose their capacity to have ordinary consensus. From my own point of view, however, that last special state was the final summation of my apprenticeship. The formidable impact of terror on the level of sober consciousness had the peculiar quality of undermining the certainty that the reality of everyday life was implicitly real, the certainty that I, in matters of ordinary reality, could provide myself with consensus indefinitely. Up to that point, the course of my apprenticeship seemed to have been a continuous building toward the collapse of that certainty. Don Juan used every facet of his dramatic exertion to accomplish the collapse during that last special state, a fact prompting me to believe that complete collapse of that certainty would have removed the last barrier that kept me from accepting the existence of a separate reality, the reality of special consensus. Appendix B, Outline for Structural Analysis. The Operative Order. The first unit, Man of Knowledge. To become a man of knowledge was a matter of learning. There were no overt requirements. There were some covert requirements. An apprentice was selected by an impersonal power, the one that was chosen, escogido. The power's decisions were indicated through omens. A man of knowledge had unbending intent, frugality, soundness of judgment, lack of freedom to innovate. A man of knowledge had clarity of mind, freedom to seek a path, knowledge of the specific purpose, being fluid. To become a man of knowledge was a matter of strenuous labor, dramatic exertion, efficacy, challenge. A man of knowledge was a warrior. He had to have respect. He had to have fear. He had to be wide awake. Awareness of intent. Awareness of the expected flux. He had to be self-confident. To become a man of knowledge was an unceasing process. He had to renew the quest of becoming a man of knowledge. He was impermanent. He had to follow the path with heart. The second unit. A man of knowledge had an ally. An ally was formless. An ally was perceived as a quality. The ally contained in datura anaxia. It was womanlike. It was possessive. It was violent. It was unpredictable. It had a deleterious effect on the character of its followers. It was a giver of superfluous power. The ally contained in psilocybe mexicana. It was male-like. It was dispassionate. It was gentle. It was predictable. It was beneficial to the character of its followers. It was a giver of ecstasy. An ally was tameable. An ally was a vehicle. The ally contained in datura anaxia was unpredictable. The ally contained in psilocybe mexicana was predictable. An ally was a helper. The third unit. An ally had a rule. The rule was inflexible. Exception due to an ally's direct intervention. The rule was non-cumulative. The rule was corroborated in ordinary reality. The rule was corroborated in non-ordinary reality. The states of non-ordinary reality. Non-ordinary reality was utilizable. Non-ordinary reality had component elements. The component elements had stability. They had singularity. They lacked ordinary consensus. The specific purpose of the rule. First specific purpose, testing datura anaxia, manipulatory techniques, ingestion. Second specific purpose, divination, datura anaxia, manipulatory technique, ingestion, absorption. Third specific purpose, bodily flight, datura anaxia, manipulatory technique, ingestion, absorption. Fourth specific purpose, testing, psilocybe mexicana. Manipulatory technique, ingestion, inhalation. Fifth specific purpose, movement, psilocybe mexicana. Manipulatory technique, ingestion, inhalation. Sixth specific purpose, movement by adopting an alternate form, psilocybe mexicana. Manipulatory technique, ingestion, inhalation. The fourth unit. The rule was corroborated by special consensus. The benefactor. Preparing special consensus. The other states of non-ordinary reality. They were produced by mescalito. It was contained. The container was the power itself. It did not have a rule. It did not need apprenticeship. It was a protector. It was a teacher. It had a definite form. Non-ordinary reality was utilizable. Non-ordinary reality had component elements. The special states of ordinary reality. They were produced by the teacher. Cueing about the environment. Cueing about behavior. The recapitulation of the experience. The recollection of events. The description of the component elements. Emphasis. positive emphasis, negative emphasis, lack of emphasis, guiding special consensus, the extrinsic level of non-ordinary reality, the preparatory period, the period prior to non-ordinary reality, the period following non-ordinary reality, the transitional stages, the teacher's supervision, the intrinsic level of non-ordinary reality, progression toward the specific, specific single forms, progressive complexity of perceived detail, progression from familiar to unfamiliar forms, specific total results, progression toward a more extensive range of appraisal, dependent range, independent range, progression toward a more pragmatic use of non-ordinary reality, progression toward the specific and special states of ordinary reality, the conceptual order, the apprentice, the fallacious adoption of the conceptual order, the bona fide adoption of the conceptual order, reality of special consensus. The reality of special consensus had pragmatic value. The end.